Hello and welcome to June on Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Can you believe it's already summer and the end of season 5? Thank you so much for joining us all season. I am thrilled to be wrapping up season 5 with a couple of my very favorite authors. They'll be sharing some of the latest research on our favorite times and favorite people. So sit back and enjoy these episodes of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am thrilled to be joined again by my Tudor friend, Helene Harrison, also known as the Tudor blogger, who is here to talk to us about her new book. And I cannot wait for her to tell us. We're so excited. I am counting down. So we're going to have her tell us about it. But before I do all that, I just want to welcome you, Helen, and thank you for joining me again.
Thank you so much for having me back, Caroline. I'm really excited to talk about this upcoming new book of mine.
Oh, well, you see that both of us have her two other books behind us, proudly displayed. So, first we have Elizabethan Rebellions, which tracks several rebellions during Elizabeth's reign, and then a real crowd pleaser, Tudor Executions, which just dives into that sort of horrible but fascinating thing that the Tudors became known for. I mean, really, a lot of the monarchs became known for executing people. So tell us a little bit about your interest in the Tudors and how you got so focused for this book on one of obviously our favorite people, Anne Boleyn.
Well, I've always sort of had history in my life, but I guess the Tudors, I kind of came at it almost sideways. I grew up sort of visiting lots of castles and ruins and priories around the UK. My dad's always been really interested in history, but he focuses more on the military naval side of things. Um, I was never really interested in that. And when I did my A levels, so that's sort of 16 to 18 years old in the UK for those who are in America. I did a module on Tudor rebellions, so we covered the whole period of rebellions, um, which was fascinating, and it sort of ignited sort of my love for that period. And then when I went to university, I did modules on women's history, on the Reformation, and then I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on Anne Boleyn, and I have it here, and it's titled "What Do Contemporary Accounts Reveal About Anne Boleyn's Public Image?" So I was just looking at the sources from her lifetime in that one. And then I went on to do my master's dissertation, which I also have here. I dug these out earlier because I just wanted to have another look. And this one's The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn, Perceptions in History, Literature and Film, which is where the title for my upcoming book comes from as well. I took that from my master's dissertation, and that sort of focused more on, I did a lot of theatre and sort of modern television in that one. So my book sort of combines the two together, really. We cover the whole period. But yeah, so I've been sort of researching Anne Boleyn for 15 years now by this point.
Wow. Wow.
So yeah, it's this is a big one for me. Yeah.
Yes. Well, it's exciting to really dig in even deeper to something you've dug into before and bring it to an audience beyond your scholarly school environment. So, this is really exciting. So, as you were doing your research, tell us a little bit
Yes.
about the research, the contemporary things, what you discovered. Did anything surprise you? All that kind of thing.
The research was interesting because obviously I'd already read a lot of the sources having written on them previously, but there were some I knew a lot less about. So I sort of mixed up a bit and started with some of the ones I knew a bit better, then did some I didn't know so well, and then went back to the ones I did know. And there was a lot of sort of television and film binging and then
Yeah.
stopping and writing quotes down. And there was a lot of sort of backwards and forwards. And I never seem to work on my chapters in order. Um, I dive backwards and forwards a lot. Particularly in this one, actually going from the contemporary sources to the more modern sources. Because when I was writing about some of the more modern sources, I wanted to go back and check a contemporary source to see where something had come from originally.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of backwards and forwards, which I think drove my friend a bit mad, who she copy edits a lot of my books before they reach my publisher. And she was like, "Why can't you just write these in order?" It's like I can't write these in order. It's not possible. Um, so that was sort of interesting, jumping backwards and forwards a lot. But I think it worked really, really well to help me connect a bit more with the sources, particularly when I was writing the more modern chapters and I needed to check where a source was, and where something had come from originally. But the thing that I think most surprised me was I was reading Nicholas Sanders' Rise and Growth of the Anglican Schism. And that's often where we cite the idea that Anne Boleyn was a witch or was accused of witchcraft, but there's actually nowhere in that text that he mentions witchcraft or her being a witch, as far as I
Wow.
could tell. Um, his idea was to promote Anne as a heretic, not as a witch,
Mm.
um, which I found really, really interesting. And I hadn't read the text that closely before. I just sort of dipped in and out of it, which was really, really interesting because it was just so unexpected. It's not what we think of when we sort of think of Sanders text. We think of the sixth finger and the
Hmm.
moles and the disfigurements and the witchcraft. And yeah, just it sort of completely blew my mind that it's not actually true at all. Um, Yeah, and I mean, I have to say a shout out to Sylvia Barbara Soberton there, who wrote a brilliant article, Large Wen or Swelling,
Hmm.
which looks at the Sander um, sort of publication as well. So she sort of first alerted me to that, and then I went back to the original text and had a look.
Yes. Well, and that's a really great shout out to Sylvia, who is amazing.
Yeah,
And the one of the things I've loved about meeting other historians as I'm doing the podcast, and I'm lucky enough to read some people's books in various drafts or whatever, is
yeah,
how helpful other historians are with each other. It's a really
yeah,
can be a wonderful community. And so that's great. Yes, to alert you to that. She's done some amazing work on Anne
she
Boleyn
has, yeah.
too. And it is interesting that Anne Boleyn and her appearance continues to be a really sort of hot issue,
Mm.
because she may not have been, I mean, we sort of have imagined her as being this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful woman, and
Yeah.
that may not have been the case, right?
No, the contemporary descriptions certainly don't describe her as beautiful. The emphasis is on her wit and her intelligence and her general charisma rather than her looks.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so she may not have been sort of physically beautiful, I guess I'd say. The allure was in her sort of uniqueness. She had that sort of French connection and the je
Mm-hmm.
ne sais quoi, if I can use that word. Um, that seems to be what her appeal was to men. And we know she did appeal to men. She had a group of men around her prior to the king. We know she had connections with Henry Percy, possibly Thomas Wyatt as well. Um, so yeah, it's an interesting one. And I did spend a lot of time trying to figure out, do we actually have any descriptions of Anne? And there's a lot of contradictory ones and a lot of ones that just sort of almost intend to denigrate her. So it's difficult to get to the truth of that. And obviously, as far as we know, there's a limited amount of portraits, although I'm very interested to hear the results of the dendrochronology on the Hever Castle portraits. So we'll see what comes of that one.
Yeah. So if you haven't heard about that, and you can help me fill in, at Haver Castle, they are doing some date testing
Mm.
on the portrait itself and on the panel that it's painted on the paint, on all of those kinds of things. There's been an assumption among some scholars that every portrait of Anne Boleyn that was even available during her lifetime was destroyed once she fell from favor, and then nobody painted her until Elizabeth came to power. But that may not be the case. We're just not sure.
No, we don't have any evidence that Henry ordered the destruction of Anne's sort of items, her portraits, anything. The only tantalizing little bit we have is an order that came to remove her sort of symbols from the palaces, but it was given in tangent with an order for Wolsey's symbols to be removed. It wasn't uncommon to replace Queen's symbols.
Mhm.
When they died, whether they were disgraced or not, it wasn't uncommon. So I don't think we can assume that anything was destroyed on Henry's orders. We don't have the evidence for it at all.
Right. And yet these assumptions have been made. And
Yeah,
it's just so interesting to go back and look for the evidence, as you say, because it's often not there. And yes, whether she had just died of natural causes, eventually her symbols might have been replaced, as a matter of
yeah.
course. So very interesting. Okay. So you mentioned your chapter titles, and you have a full disclosure. I know some of them, but I know you don't want to give everything away.
No.
But are you willing to share some of them, and just they give us such a sense of what's to come? And so just tell us how you came up with these titles, because the idea of charting her faces, her many faces, which I love,
Yeah.
from her time to our time. I mean, that could be so overwhelming. So I love the way you've organized it. So tell us a little bit about that and the titles and what they give us a glimpse into.
Well, it was actually something that again came out of my master's dissertation. Um, Weirdly, I was working very closely with my supervisor at the time, who's a absolutely brilliant. We're still in touch, and she's been really, really helpful. Um, but I discussed three plays in my master's dissertation. So I looked at William Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, and John Banks, and they all take a very different approach to how they portray Anne. So my chapter on Shakespeare was Anne as mother. My chapter on Bacon was Anne as victim, and my chapter on the John Banks play was Anne as queen. So there were three very different interpretations, and I've just sort of taken that a bit further with this book and thought there's so many different interpretations of Anne. And it's a lot of these documents, it's about the intention of the author who wrote them. What did they want or aim to get out of it, and what bias was in it? So it's a lot of it's about what the authors aim to achieve with it. So we see there's a lot about Anne as a traitor in how she ended her life. We get a lot of that. Um, and then we're hearing a bit more about Anne as a mother. Tracy Borman's done some brilliant work there. Um, so I've sort of taken it and sort of divided the documents and things that I'm looking at into these different faces that we see of Anne. Obviously, there is some crossover, and different sort of documents can fall into different categories. But I thought it was quite an interesting way to look at the different ways that she's been perceived and how it changes across the centuries as well.
Yeah, so can you give us a little bit of how it has changed, just sort of generally, because we want to get into the meat of it when we get your book. But her image and her faces, as you say, have changed from her time. It's not just a zoom to our time, that it's always been the same.
No.
So can you give us just a couple of milestones along that path?
Yeah, so early on, we obviously see Anne as very sort of alluring. She's very attractive. She's a mistress, whether in the physical sense or not. She's sort of seen as almost on a pedestal. Um, and we then have this crash where she falls and she's almost wiped from history at that point. No one wants to talk about her or is afraid to talk about her. And then we have this sort of revival under Elizabeth where, we see this image of Anne at Elizabeth's coronation procession. We have Shakespeare including her in his play, although I have to say her role is pretty minimal in that play. Um, but the idea is that she's there as the mother to the Queen. So we sort of have this revival, even though it's often said, Elizabeth, she didn't know her mother, she didn't really appreciate her mother, but I hope we're starting to see a change in that point of view now. And then also in Elizabeth's reign and into the Stuart reign, we start to see a focus on Anne's religion as Elizabeth sort of builds the new church. We see the religious settlement at the beginning of her reign. And we have these sort of opposing views. So we see Nicholas Sander sees Anne as a schismatic, a heretic, but then we have John Foxe in the Book of Martyrs. So we have these very opposing views. And then it almost goes a bit quiet again on Anne. We sort of have this sort of dearth in between sort of the mid-Stuart to the Victorian period. There's very little to go on, really. And then under the Victorians, we again have this revival. We have Queen Victoria writing in her diary that she's visited Hever before she becomes queen, this is. But she seems to have this sort of love for Anne and this affection for her. And it's under her that we see the excavations at the Tower Chapel. We have biographies coming out, Strickland's, Paul Friedman is writing. And we have these romanticized images being painted as well. So Anne becomes this sort of tragic heroine in the Victorian eyes. So that was a really, really interesting thing to be looking at, how that change happened. And then we're into the 20th century where we start to see her on screen and in fiction, which we didn't really see before this period. Even the plays that we see, although they are fictionalized, they're almost propaganda. Whereas nowadays we have it just for entertainment purposes. So it's been interesting to look at that sort of 500-year arc of how things have changed.
Yes, and Victoria is just an interesting figure, the Victorian time and Victoria herself being so drawn to Anne and also Elizabeth. Um,
Yes.
Victoria's you took the always the same semper idem, and really at the very first of her reign, we don't remember this because she was married to Albert so completely and for so long. But at the first of her reign, she said that she'd remain single for a while, like Elizabeth did, So it seems to be
Yeah.
she had this affection, which I think supported some of that fascination with Anne. So you've mentioned some of the different ways. So as a reformer, the focus is on the religion. As a mother, the focus is on her producing Elizabeth, who ended up to be quite successful compared to her other half siblings. And then this idea of a tragic heroine, which, kind of brings us into the 20th century where we begin to see her on screen. So can
Yeah.
you tell us some of the interesting various just dip us into a little bit of the portrayals of Anne? And again, don't give it away because we can't wait to read. I just can't wait. But just tease us a little bit because some of the people who've portrayed Anne were a bit of a surprise. So let's just, say what are some of the portrayals we've seen of Anne?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of them that I hadn't really seen before I started researching this book, so that was quite interesting. I'd never seen The Private Life of Henry VIII, which is 1933, so it's one of the earliest ones we've got, and it's Merle Oberon as Anne Boleyn. And she only appears, I think, in about the first 15 minutes of the film or something. It's a very short period, and we only really see her execution. Um, but it was a fascinating portrayal to watch. Um, and it was just the whole setup was fascinating because we also have sort of there's comments from people who are watching the execution. So the focus isn't all on Anne. We just sort of get glimpses of her during this process, which is it kind of distances you from it a little bit. Um, which, given some of the more modern portrayals, we see it in a lot more detail nowadays, which again shows the shift, I think, in sensibilities. Um, so that was really fascinating. Um, but one of my all-time favorites has got to be Anne of a Thousand Days. I think Genevieve Bujold did
Mhm.
an amazing job. I don't think it was entirely accurate, but I think she really caught Anne's fire, just that passion and that charisma. Um, yeah, and just some of her conversations with Henry, the way she played that. Um, and of course, that final scene in the Tower of London where she confronts Henry. That's the scene that always lives in everyone's minds, I think, once they've seen the film. Um, and the costumes were divine in that film as well, I have to say. Um, yeah, that's just got to be my all-time favorite portrayal, I think. Although I do also have a soft spot for Natalie Dormer in The Tudors and particularly Claire Foy in Wolf Hall as well. They're three very different portrayals, but I think the real Anne probably lies somewhere between Genevieve Bujold and Claire Foy. I think it's somewhere sort of in the middle of those because I think Claire Foy, that interpretation at times, I think because it's seen through Cromwell's eyes, we're not really seeing who Anne was, we're seeing who Cromwell thought Anne was, um, which again is a very interesting interpretation of looking at Anne, and it's very different from anything else I think we see on screen.
Well, that's really interesting because some of those you brought up. So we see in the private lives of Henry VIII,
Yeah.
private life of Henry VIII. The focus is not very much on Anne. As you say, she's just in for a few minutes and it's almost over before it begins, which is so different
Mm.
from anything else dealing with the Tudors. Anne is a big part of it. So that is so interesting to me. I was
Yeah.
very surprised by the older version where she's not the main
I think
attraction
that's
because she's
why
so
I wanted to make sure I included that one because it is so different to the more modern ones. It's one of the first sort of interpretations we have of Anne on screen, and it's one of the only ones where she's not in the center. So I thought that one was, although we only get a few minutes really of her on screen, I thought it was incredibly important to include that one.
yes, because it does show us something of the time, something of the decision to make a movie about Henry VIII that starts at the end of Anne Boleyn rather than
Yeah.
the beginning. So that is really interesting. And of course, Genevieve, that's my favorite. So I'm all with you there. I remember seeing that and just that was it for me. She was it. But some of the more recent, and Claire Foy is a really interesting one
Mm.
to talk about because it's through someone else's eyes. And of course,
Yeah.
this is Hilary Mantel's brilliant version of Cromwell, which very much is Cromwell's story and his interaction with her through that lens. So when we're looking at her through Cromwell's eyes, what do you think shifts? So uh, in other words, how does he see her? And what are some of the things that struck you about that version of her?
Well, we see less of the personal with Anne. We see less of Anne and Henry. We see more of Anne as a political figure, because Cromwell wouldn't have been privy to a lot of those private moments, so we don't see them on screen. Um, and I thought The Mirror and the Light, it was interesting that we still get to see Anne and how she haunts Cromwell almost. She haunts his memory, um, which I thought was interesting because I have always thought, how often did Cromwell think about Anne? Because he played a major role in what happened to her. And he didn't survive her by all that long. We're talking 4 years. just over. Um, so I have wondered that how sort of did Cromwell feel about Anne when she was dead? So it's quite interesting to see that play out on screen. Um, but I think the original season of Wolf Hall, where Anne is a major player in that season, it was fascinating to hear that French lilt as well, which I think she probably did have in her voice. She'd spent so many years at the French court. I think she must have had some kind of French lilt or French accent, although how pronounced it would have been, I'm not sure. And I think hers is really the only portrayal where we really see that as well. So that was really interesting when I first heard her speak in that role. Um, and of course, the first word she says, we hear her say, is Cromwell in that French accent. And I think she played it really well. She played it really powerfully, I think. She was very determined to show Anne sort of as her own person and shaping her own sort of life and her own destiny. Um, and I think it did work really well. It's just interesting that we see her through someone else's eyes, so we miss a lot of that personal interaction with the king.
I think that's a really good point, and it's an opportunity for us to see her in a political role and to remember because there's a lot about Henry and the romance and his letters and all of that. But to see the politics, I just think that's a fascinating way and something really interesting to bring through in that version, as you say.
Yeah, I think starting it with Wolsey's fall as well, we miss a lot of that earlier sort of Anne Henry back and forward relationship. They're already established at this point. And I think in a lot of portrayals, a lot of it is on the back and forward, the love letters, them getting to that point. So I think it's interesting that with Wolf Hall, we're starting when they're already established as a couple that Anne is going to be the future queen.
Yes. So we missed that first bit. That's really important and that's true. So we've looked at some of the portrayals of her,
Mm.
um, big screen, small screen, and tell us a little bit about um, her representation. And the way you put it, if I hope that's all right to mention this, is on the page. So some
Yeah.
of the as well as being portrayed by an actress on in a
Mm.
movie or on television, what are we seeing as she evolves on the page as well?
Yeah, the fictional portrayals, I found it really, really difficult to narrow down because there's so many of them. And I chose a couple, I think I cover five in the book. And there's a couple that people might not have heard of or might not be aware of, um, but which I really enjoyed. Um, so I thought I'd include them. Um, so I cover Alison Weir's Six Tudor Queens novel, the Anne Boleyn one. I look at Susanna Dunn's Queen of Subtleties, Jean Plaidy, I look at as well. And the other two that people might not have heard of, I look at Laura Anderson has written a trilogy. Um, I only look at the first book because the first one's the only one that features Anne, and it's called The Boleyn King. And it's almost a what if Anne hadn't miscarried in January 1536? What if she had a son and that son succeeded Henry VIII as king? So we see Anne in that portrayal as a dowager queen, and her brother is the regent, because the son was underage when Henry died. So that was a really interesting one to look at what could have potentially happened, and how Anne's portrayed in that. And then the last one I look at is it's actually written by an author who is local to me. She lives in my local area. And it's Jennifer C. Wilson's Kindred Spirits, um, which is also a series. I only examined the first one. And it is actually based in modern times, so it's slightly sort of doesn't fit with the others. Um, and it's a bit difficult to explain, but it's basically about ghosts at the Tower of London. So we have the ghosts of Anne and George Boleyn, Richard III, George, Duke of Clarence, Jane Grey, Catherine Howard. So we see all of these big figures that wouldn't have met in real life. We know Richard III can't have met Anne Boleyn, for instance. Um, but it's just there's lots of hints back to what happened. Um, and I wanted to look at how Anne was portrayed and how the time she'd spent as a ghost could have changed her. Um, and there's just it's very funny. There's lots of humor. So right at the start, for instance, Anne Boleyn is talking to Richard III, and she says to him, "Where's George?" And Richard said, "Yours or mine," because obviously they both have siblings called George, and those two are sort of the pranksters of the group. So they're pranking tourists, making things move. There's just lots of very funny moments in it, but there's also some really great moments where Anne talks about her execution and the charges against her. Richard III wants to find out what happened to the princes in the Tower. There's lots of little things that sort of come together, and it was so different. I just thought I want this for the contrast with some of the other works that I discuss.
I think that's great because it's so imaginative and
Yeah.
different and puts her in contact and conversation with these other historic figures, as you
Yeah.
say, but also the humor. I mean,
Yeah.
because we tend to think more of the glamour and the love and then the tragedy,
Yeah.
but she is described as witty and humorous in some contemporary sources. And so to see that play out, I thought that's a really fun,
Yeah.
part of her.
It's a nice juxtaposition, I think, to the likes of Alison Weir, who she discusses Anne's execution in a lot of detail at the end of that novel. Um, and yeah, I thought it was just quite nice to have some very different interpretations, which is why I wanted to put those latter two in the alternative history and the ghosts, just because it's something very different that shows how our treatment of Anne is evolving. We're looking at her in very different ways.
Yes, and I wanted to follow up with that a little bit as we've sort of seen in her time. Once Henry has decided she's going to be gone, then that was sort of the required opinion. And so much of what you see immediately was, oh, we're so glad she's gone. Whether people felt that way or not, that was the politic thing to say.
Yeah.
Um, and then you talked about the Victorian sort of interest evolving in her
Mm.
and her reputation seeming to be rescued a bit. Is that maybe too strong a word? I'm not sure, but
There's certainly more interest in her and in what happened to her. Um, but I think the Victorians, they wanted to portray her as this tragic figure. So I think that was sort of the prevailing thing. They didn't we don't see a rounded Anne emerge. It's very much this is how we want to see her. So this is sort of the portrayals we're going to put out there.
yes. So you've mentioned that we're seeing a more rounded Anne, and in
Mm.
some of the portrayals, and I think in the scholarship as well,
Yeah.
we are looking at a more rounded picture of Anne or face of Anne, to use your word. Can you tell us a little bit about that idea, the more complete view of Anne that tends to be emerging now?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because my last chapter I discussed the historiography of Anne and sort of a lot of the modern interpretations. Um, but we've sort of seen this develop really from the 90s. It's sort of there's been sort of a revival of historical interest, and obviously now we're seeing so many sort of new books. We're still making new discoveries. I discussed Kate McCaffrey's work. Um, and yeah, the fascination shows no sign of dying down at any time soon. Um, so I discuss a lot of different historians viewpoints. Often you'll see at the beginning or the end of a book, there'll be sort of a sentence or a short paragraph of the overall opinion of Anne. And I bring a lot of these together, and the overall sort of prevailing view is an admiration of Anne. There's a lot of mentions of Elizabeth, obviously, but people are focusing on Anne's charisma, her bravery, um, obviously her reign and her rise sort of changed the face of England forever. We couldn't come back from what happened. So it was just, we're seeing more interest in different parts of Anne's life. We're seeing more interest in her childhood and her adolescence, although the sources are lacking. Um, we're still seeing that you can piece things together from other people's experiences, what Anne might have had. We've seen that in a recent online event with Natalie Grueninger and Owen Emerson discussing Anne's early years, which was fascinating. I hadn't really thought much about Anne's childhood because there just aren't the sources. But to try and piece it together from what we know of other people of a similar background, we can sort of get a sense of what she might have done, what she might have known at different points. So I think it's great that we're still investigating because there are a lot of holes in Anne's story. There's missing evidence. There's things that we're never going to know. But I think that's half the fun of the history is being able to think about what might have been. But the important thing is don't give it as fact if we don't have the evidence for it. We can suppose and question, but yeah, we're never going to know everything, but I think that's half the fun of it.
Right. And you mentioned a couple of things in particular that we have had come out recently. So Kate McCaffrey has done
Yeah.
some brilliant work on some of the people around Anne, and the Book of Hours that,
Yeah.
that book itself tells a whole story that has been
Yeah.
recently discovered. So, the idea of continuing to
Yeah.
study and research. Also, the Falcon, the crowned falcon that is now at Hampton Court, probably started there, that was so gloriously restored, but had somehow come off the wall and had a whole
Who
life
knows how
after.
that happened?
Right. But it is fascinating to see some of that, and Tracy's work, as you mentioned, with thinking of Anne and Elizabeth and what could have been with them. So all of that in terms of new things and new ways of looking at Anne as a complete person,
Yeah.
has been really wonderful. So I want to kind of go back similar to where we started, as you have had Anne in a center for you, right? From undergraduate to graduate, and your research and work on her.
Mm.
So as you wrote this book, were there things you learned about Anne that changed opinions you had or reinforced opinions you had in your earlier experiences with Anne?
I think the main thing for me that's developed over time is my approach to Anne's religion and her
Mm,
religious views, because it's often said Anne was a Protestant, but the term didn't even really exist. It certainly wasn't in common use at that time. And looking now at some of the sources, some of the things she believed, I don't think we can say Anne was a Protestant. She certainly wanted reform of the church, as I think many people did at the time. People could see that, there were a lot of corruptions and there was a lot of financial irregularities and things like that happening. So I think she definitely wanted reform of the church. And we know, she argued with Cromwell, who wanted to put all the money from the dissolution into the king's coffers, and Anne wanted to redirect it to charity and education. Um, so I think that's definitely developed for me because I think in my reading back through my undergraduate dissertation, I'd certainly, it seems I'd portrayed Anne as a Protestant, whereas now I don't believe she was. I think she had a lot of views that were still essentially Catholic. Um, I think in the Tower that particularly showed, um, she still went back to that conservative faith at the end, um, which I think is it's an important period for her because she knows she's going to die. And I think she's going back to those true beliefs, that core, inner core of herself, because she was raised with these conservative views, the early 1500s. Um, so that's definitely changed for me over the years. And again, her generally the way she looked and her image, I yeah, reading some of the sort of contemporary descriptions of what she looked at, I think we have a Venetian description that wasn't particularly flattering of Anne. Um, so yeah, there's definitely things that have changed over the last 15 years, but I think that's just the nature of as you read more, particularly as you read more contemporary sources. Because at university, I was really just starting with the contemporary sources. I hadn't read as widely as I have now. So yeah, I definitely think things have changed in how I think about Anne. But I think I respect her more as a result.
And that's great. I mean, so I guess the next question is, are there still things to learn about Anne Boleyn? Because we do get a lot of study of her. She is the topic of a lot of discussions. Um, she has captured the imagination over, as you say, 500 years, and it doesn't seem to be waning much. People are still. So, what is there still to learn?
I think there's sort of a limited number of biographies of Anne that can still be brought out because I think we've pretty much covered what we currently have of her life. But we're seeing a lot of different interpretations now. I hope mine is one of them. Um, but we've obviously got Estelle Peronc's recent book about the French connection. Natalie Grueninger obviously writes a lot on Anne's final months and her final year. Tracy Borman about the connection with Elizabeth. So I think it's these sort of little bits of Anne's life where there's still more to find, or there's still new ways to read the existing sources. I think we've probably reached the limit of actual biographies of Anne at this point, because we'd just be regurgitating the same material. Um, I think to write a book on Anne now, you have to have something new or different to say, a new interpretation or way of looking at the evidence. Um, because otherwise we're just going to keep saying the same things instead of looking for something new. And I think a lot of the recent books on Anne have taken very different approaches to it, um, which is all to the good because it means we're hopefully understanding and unraveling a bit more of what we know about Anne and the people around her as well.
Oh, that's a great way of saying that, and I appreciate you mentioning some of the recent books that have come out, and we we know that Kate has hinted that there's a book somewhere in her future too,
Yes.
Kate McCaffrey. So we look forward to that as well. Now, speaking of Kate McCaffrey, you have a very special person do the forward. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? Because I know you announced that on social media, so I feel like I can ask about that.
Yes. At the time of recording, I only announced it yesterday, so it's
Yes.
still very new news. I mean, I've known about it for about 6 months now, but I've sort of been sitting on the information, waiting for the right time to reveal it. But I thought 3 months before the book comes out, is a good sort of benchmark to be hitting. So yeah, I was thrilled that Dr. Owen Emerson wrote the foreword for this book. He's obviously incredibly well known in terms of researching Anne Boleyn. He's been the castle historian at Hever. Um, so yeah, it's just I'm still in shock. I mean, 6 months after getting the foreword, I'm still in shock. Um, I was actually in bed about to go to sleep when the email pinged through. Um, and I saw Owen's name and just went, nope, this can't wait till the morning. I'm reading this now. And I nearly fell out of bed and burst into tears. So yeah, I'm absolutely thrilled by it. He said some incredibly nice things in that foreword. I shared two short quotes on my social media, so people can go and look those up if they want to. And it's also gone out in my Substack newsletter yesterday as well. Um, so yeah, it's just amazing. I'm so grateful to Owen for reading an early copy of the book. I mean, this was before it had even been through editing or anything like that. So yeah, he's a very busy man, but he still took the time out to read this and provide some very, very thoughtful and kind comments.
Yes. So I wanted to mention that. And I did wait till you'd gone public. I was so happy that we were talking after when I saw it yesterday, it come out on social media. I thought, okay, then I can ask about it, hopefully. So thank you for sharing that. That is, again, something else to look forward to.
Yeah.
So tell us now when we can get our hands on this book. It's not out yet. That's why there's not one behind either of us. But tell us
No.
when we can get our hands on it.
It's being released in the UK on the 31st of July, 2025. I believe the American date is scheduled for the 30th of September. So if you're ordering from Barnes and Noble, it'll be the September date. But hopefully you can still order from somewhere in the UK if you want your hands on it earlier.
Yes, yes. So I know that Waterstones will ship to the US
Oh, they are again now.
and Blackwell will ship
Oh,
to the
they will.
US. And I'm
Yeah.
sure others as well, but those are the two I often go to.
Yeah.
So now I can't let you go without asking, and I know that you're still in the midst of this and celebrating the release and all of that, but what's next for you?
I am currently writing my fourth book, which will hopefully be out in 2026, which is on Henry VIII's Great Matter and his long quest to get a male heir. Um, so yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, it still ties in quite closely with Anne Boleyn. So yeah, it's interesting to write. I'm over two-thirds of the way through that now, so hopefully it won't be too long before I'm ready to submit. And then I'll be straight on to book five, which I'm also commissioned for, but I am currently keeping quiet on the topic of that one.
Well, that is fair because we have now two to look forward to. The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn coming sooner, in fact, soon this
Hmm.
year, July, the end of July in the UK. And again, for me and my American followers, I will put a link to Waterstones and Blackwell where you can order from the UK if you can't wait till September. I never can.
I
So,
believe my publisher will also ship to
oh,
America
yes,
if
that's
people do
true.
want to order direct from Pen and Sword.
Pen and Sword also ships to the US. Yes, I've done that as well. So, US friends, don't despair. we can get it. And so, but in the US, it will come out September, I believe you said.
I think
So,
it's currently slated for the 30th of September in America.
okay. Well, we'll stay up to date on that. Now, where can we follow you in the meanwhile?
I'm on, let me think, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, all at Tudor Blogger. I am also on Substack. Tudor Blogger, The History Notes is my Substack, so people can subscribe there. I release a monthly newsletter that is only available to my Substack subscribers. Um, I think that might be everywhere. I am on LinkedIn. If anyone wants to connect on LinkedIn, send me a request.
All right. So we will have those links in the show notes so that we can keep up with you as we count down together to the release of this great new book about Anne Boleyn. And I think the idea of her playing all these roles and having all
Mm.
these different ways of impacting different periods of time and being seen in different ways is a
Yeah.
fascinating new way to think about her
Yes.
because she did play so many roles and was a different person in those different roles.
Yeah.
And even today we see portrayals. You mentioned the Wolf Hall series in particular, where we see through Cromwell's eyes a political Anne Boleyn, whereas with Clairefoy, whereas Geneviève Bujold in Anne of the Thousand Days, that wasn't so much the politics, but we see the fiery Anne Boleyn, so we can see that there as well. And so that is great. So thank you so much for joining us and getting us so excited for the release of this book and reminding us there is more to learn about this woman who continues to fascinate us 500 years on.
Thank you very much for having me, Caroline. I hope people can maybe discover a new document or a new portrayal that they didn't know existed.
Yes, that's always fun that you bring to us different ways of seeing Anne, so she continues to emerge. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We are really grateful for you joining us on this journey. And again, I'll have information on where we can order the book, the hopeful publication dates, maybe even sometimes it's an early release. So we'll look for that as well. But thank you, everyone, for joining us on Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. See you again soon. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics, and for being with us throughout season 5. If I could ask a favor, if you would please leave us a rating, maybe share with a friend, it helps so much. Thank you to all of the listeners, and a huge shout out to all of my patrons who literally make the podcast possible. Have a great summer. We'll be back for some summer specials. See you soon on Royals, Rebels, and Romantics.